Bienvenidos al canal Viajando con Buda. Hoy tenemos un invitado muy especial, de talla mundial. Un libro suyo supuso un antes y un después en la historia del budismo. Su historia es extraordinaria y merece ser contada. Eran los años 60 del siglo pasado y un joven norteamericano de Nebraska, de ideas pacifistas, tras graduarse en la universidad, decide evitar el servicio militar obligatorio. Para ello, ve como la opción más fácil irse como misionero metodista a Japón durante 3 años. Sin embargo, aquella experiencia no sale como estaba planeada. Japón y el budismo le cambiarían a él para siempre. Tras los 3 primeros años de compromiso con el grupo metodista, decidió sumergirse en el aprendizaje del idioma japonés y tras ello entró en la Universidad de Komazawa, que es una universidad asociada a la escuela de Soto Zen, donde realizó estudios budistas durante 4 años. Durante todo aquel tiempo había profundizado en el Zen junto a un maestro y posteriormente pasaría la formación como sacerdote Zen. Por aquel tiempo, la guerra de Vietnam estaba en todo su apogeo y él decidió asistir a las manifestaciones que había en Japón en contra de aquella guerra. Entonces recibe una llamada de atención de la escuela de Soto Zen. Le dicen que un sacerdote no debe involucrarse en política y que corre peligro su estatus de sacerdote Zen. Él, por supuesto, no dejaría de asistir a estas manifestaciones, pero aquella reunión le marcaría para siempre y abrió en él una importante reflexión. ¿Por qué no podía estar comprometido él con la paz como sacerdote Zen? ¿No pregonaban acaso los sutras budistas sobre la compasión a todos los seres sintientes? La cuestión es que empezó a investigar sobre estas cuestiones y encontró cosas muy importantes. Por ejemplo, el silencio que había existido en Japón desde la derrota en la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Había habido un pacto de silencio. Lo que él descubrió fue la complicidad de las instituciones budistas japonesas con el imperialismo y el militarismo durante la primera mitad del siglo XX. Las barbaridades que cometió el ejército japonés durante aquel tiempo son difícilmente entendibles. Un ejército que realizó indiscriminadas matanzas de civiles por toda Asia. La más cruel de todas en la ciudad china de Nankín, donde se calcula que tras la toma de la ciudad se masacraron a 250.000 civiles. Un ejército que no por casualidad se considera el más cruel de todos los ejércitos que participaron en la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Y la verdad que él descubrió fue que las instituciones budistas apoyaron a ese ejército que cometió tantísimas masacres. Nuestro invitado de esta noche es el escritor y profesor universitario Brian Victoria. Él sacó a la luz no solo que el budismo japonés apoyó incluso financieramente todo el esfuerzo bélico, sino que llegó a subvertir completamente la doctrina budista para legitimar las acciones imperialistas y militares del Japón de aquella época. Brian Victoria se encontró con muchas personas relevantes dentro del budismo japonés que le dieron información y le apoyaron en continuar sus investigaciones. Pensaban que solo un occidental podría romper el muro de silencio que se había instaurado sobre esa época del budismo. El resultado de toda esa investigación fue su magnífico Zen at War, Zen en guerra en su traducción al castellano, En el libro se exponía cómo grandes maestros budistas, venerados en Japón y en Occidente, tenían un pasado un tanto oscuro. Textos que ahora nos parecen vergonzosos salieron a la luz pública de Occidente. Su libro generó muchas polémicas, rompió no pocas actitudes ingenuas, pero sobre todo nos hizo ver cómo hasta una joya como el Zen, con tantos siglos de sabiduría, de verdaderos y profundos maestros, puede convertirse en un instrumento de guerra, si se desvirtúa y cae en malas manos. El libro de Brian Victoria fue un libro necesario, un libro que sirvió para que el budismo japonés, especialmente el Zen, se mirase a sí mismo e iniciara un movimiento de reflexión y reforma que llevó a que por primera vez determinadas instituciones budistas japonesas asumieran su responsabilidad histórica y pidieran públicamente perdón. Por supuesto, Brian Victoria ha seguido escribiendo libros y artículos, especialmente sobre el tema del budismo y la violencia. Su libro más importante, Zen at War, no está todavía publicado en español, aunque confiamos que en algún momento lo esté. Como decíamos, Brian Victoria ha querido estar en este vídeo y nos va a leer un breve extracto de su libro más importante. Nos hablará del héroe de guerra japonés y filósofo budista Sugimoto Goro y su maestro Yamazaki Ekiyu, donde se muestra cómo pervierten la doctrina budista en pos de objetivos militaristas y nacionalistas. Muchas gracias, Brian, por compartir con nosotros tu tiempo.
All right. Well, thank you, Jesus, for inviting me to be part of this program. It's a privilege to meet you and hopefully to meet many new friends in Spain. All right. So, unfortunately, tonight, Jesus, we don't have a very happy topic. And the topic is war. And I say it's not a happy topic. I'd like it to be a historical program about the bad history that happened in the past. But unfortunately, as we all know, the problem of war is not historical. It is historical, but it's happening as we speak. And even as we record this program, there are hundreds, probably thousands of people who are dying in the Ukraine, in Gaza, Sudan, Yemen, and many other countries in the world. And so unfortunately, this is not a program it is a program about the past, but it's also a program about the present. And I'm afraid to say it will probably be a program about the future. But I think all of us are interested in this program, first of all, because some of us, like myself, are disappointed that Buddhism would be involved, and other people will be disappointed that religion is so often involved in war and killing, when all religions promise to have, to give their believers a wonderful future and happiness. And how does it end up that so many religions, in fact, I think most, if not all religions, at one time or another, have been involved in not only warfare, but in promoting warfare? So that's kind of a question. We're not going to be able to answer that question in tonight's program, but at least I hope we'll have part of the answer. All right. So with that in mind, I'd like to begin the formal part of the program by talking about a man called Lieutenant Colonel Sugimoto Goro. Now, I know you've introduced him in the past on one of your past programs, but I think that probably some of the listeners today may not have seen the past program. So let's talk a little bit about who he was before we go further. So Sugimoto Goro, of course, was a Japanese officer. He was born in 1900 in Hiroshima Prefecture. He entered the imperial military at age 18. He became a second lieutenant or an officer in 1921. He fought in China for the first time in 1928. Then he fought there a second time in 1931. When he fought in 1931, he was part of the Japanese military effort that was successful in setting up a Japanese puppet country called Manchukuo, which was established in Manchuria. All right. Then full-scale warfare broke out between China and Japan in the summer of 1937. In August of 37, he was promoted to the rank of major, and the next month he was sent again to China to be part of that full-scale warfare between Japan and China. And he was killed early in the war. He was killed in September of 1937. Now, it's important to know that he was killed at the very beginning of the full-scale war because he kept a war diary. And his diary, after he was killed, his diary was sent back to Japan. And because they wanted to convince other Japanese, especially young Japanese men, that they should also enter the military and fight for their country. And so he was used, Sugimoto Goro was used as an example of an ideal Japanese fighting man, an ideal Japanese officer. And what made him ideal was the fact that he was so totally devoted to the emperor. In his diary makes it very, very clear of his total devotion to the emperor and to the country. Also, though, for our purposes, well, his diary also makes very clear that he was very dedicated and that he received a great deal of spiritual support from his Zen training. And so that's really what I'd like to talk about is the spiritual support he received. But rather than talking about himself and what he wrote, I'd like to talk about his Zen master. His Zen master became a very famous Zen master. His name was Yamazaki Ekiju. And he primarily became famous because in the diary that Sugimoto Goro kept, it was later made into a book. And the book was given the title Great Duty. In Japanese, it's called Taigi, but that means great duty. Great duty, in this case, to the emperor. And in that book, Yamazaki wrote the eulogy, praise for his student of many years, Sugimoto Goro. And so I'd like to share tonight some of the passages from the book Great Duty that Yamazaki wrote to praise what a wonderful fighting man and what a man of Zen Sugimoto was. And that will help us understand why Zen and the Japanese war effort were so closely connected during World War II. So with that background in mind, let me read a few passages that will give you a sense of what Yamazaki Ekiju thought about Sugimoto and how Yamazaki Ekiju interpreted Zen. Is that okay?
Yes, perfect.
All right.
Perfect.
So I'll be reading then from the book, and this book is called Zen at War. All right. And it was my first book on this topic. And so again, I'm reading the words of Yamazaki Ekiju, who was Lieutenant Colonel Sugimoto. By the way, the reason he became a lieutenant colonel was because after an officer died on the battlefield, he was given the next higher rank automatically. So he was a major, but then after he died, he was given the rank of lieutenant colonel. So this is what Yamazaki Ekiju thought of his disciple. So Yamazaki Ekiju says, I once said at a lecture I gave, the faith of the Japanese people is a faith that should be centered on His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor. At that time, Sugimoto said that he was in complete agreement with me. He then went on to add, quote, I had felt exactly as you do, but I had been unable to find the right words to express it. Present-day religionists raise a fuss about the need for faith, but their faith is mistaken. Buddhists say that one should have faith in the Buddha, or Mahavairochana, or Amida Buddha. But such faith is one that is limited to religion alone. Japanese Buddhism must be centered on the emperor, for if it were not, it would have no place in Japan. It would not be living Buddhism. Buddhism, including Shakyamuni's teachings, must conform to the national polity of Japan. So, and then he continued, Yakiju continued, the Buddhist statues that are enshrined in temples should, properly speaking, have the emperor reverently enshrined in the center, and such figures as Amida Buddha or Mahavairochana at his sides. It is only the various branches of the Zen sect in Japan who have His Majesty enshrined in the center. All of Japanese Buddhism, all of Japanese Buddhism should have His Majesty, the Emperor, as their central object of worship. Right? Now, then Yamazaki continues. As far as the power of his practice of the way, of the Buddha way is concerned, I believe Sugimoto reached the point where there was no difference between him and the chief abbot of this or that branch of Zen. I think that when a person esteems practice, respects the way, and thoroughly penetrates the self as he did, he is qualified to be the teacher of other Zen practitioners. That is how accomplished he was. In my opinion, his practice was complete. Now, when a Zen master says to a disciple, your practice is complete, that means I accept or I believe you are totally enlightened, just like the Buddha was. So that's the highest praise that a Zen master could give to his disciple. All right. Then he
Incredible.
continues.
What a distortion of the Buddhism.
Yes. So then he talks about Sugimoto and the sword. And Yamazaki says, I don't know what degree of attainment he had in the way of the sword, but it appears he was quite accomplished. When he went to the battlefield, it appears that he used the sword with consummate skill. I believed he demonstrated the action that derives from the unity of Zen and the sword. This idea of the unity of Zen and the sword, I should tell everyone, is something that had long been present in Japan because of the fact that the samurai class, the warrior class, were the original patrons, supporters of Zen in Japan from the 1300s, well, from the 1200s onwards. So the idea of the unity of Zen and the sword is a very old idea in Japan, but according to Yamazaki, Sugimoto was a perfect example of that. All right. And then we continue here, and we're getting close to the end of the quotes now. So at this point, Yamazaki is finishing his eulogy of Sugimoto. He says, to the last second, Sugimoto was a man whose speech and actions were at one with each other. When he saluted and faced the east would be where the emperor in Japan, from Manchuria, it would be to the east. When he saluted and faced the east, there is no doubt that he also shouted, may His Majesty, the Emperor, live for 10,000 years. Many of us probably know that just simply as Ten no Heika, which is his emperor. Banzai. Banzai means 10,000 years. May the emperor live for 10,000 years. It is for this reason that his was the radiant ending of an imperial soldier. Not only that, but his excellent example should be a model for future generations of someone who lived in Zen. Although it can be said that his life of 38 years was all too short, for someone who has truly obtained meditation power, long and short are not important. The great true example of Sugimoto Goro was that of one who had united with emptiness, embodying total loyalty to the emperor and service to the state. I am convinced he is one of those who, should he be reborn 7 times over, would reverently work to destroy the enemies of the emperor. All right. So this is what Sugimoto Goro's master, Yamazaki Ekiju, thought of his disciple. And because he was in that book, The Great Duty, he then became probably the most famous Zen master in Japan during World War II. But he was only all of the other Zen masters were saying the same thing. So he was not exceptional in any way. He was
I know.
really a good representative of what the other Zen masters were saying.
The problem is that it's very difficult to find exception. Very difficult. Very difficult.
Yes.
Could you tell me exception? Exception, a important person in like Zen master? I don't think you can find one.
Well, what happened in Japan was that there were some exceptions in the early 1900s, but they were executed. And once they were executed, then the other Zen masters said, "Oh, I don't want that. I don't want that fate." And so then they all became supporters. So by the time of World War II, they were only supporters.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit, Jesus, at the end here about where did people like Yamazaki Ekiju go wrong? Well, where did Sugimoto Goro go wrong? Why? What was his mistake? What were all of their mistakes? And I'd like to suggest we all know, those of us who know about Buddhism know that it teaches to be opposed to attachment. All right?
Exactly.
And the attachment that it talks about is attachment to the self. But it's clear in my mind that Sugimoto was not attached to his self. He was a great and a powerful and a soldier. He was not worried about his own death. All right? But Buddhism's teaching about attachment is not just about attachment to oneself, it's attachment to anything. So what happened with Sugimoto and with these Zen masters is that they did what? They substituted attachment to self with attachment to the emperor, with attachment to the country. And they thought that because they had freed themselves from self-attachment, that they were free of attachment. But they had substituted self-attachment with attachment to the country, with attachment to the emperor. All right.
Exactly.
Now,
Exactly.
when the Buddhists talk about non-attachment, they're talking about non-attachment to everything, and especially non-attachment to one's country too.